Well, I'm grateful that you're all here to discuss Providence, and I'm hoping you found the readings helpful. This is actually a thing I haven't done in a long time, is gone back between these two positions, and I think it's because honestly, different denominations care more about having this conversation that is Calvinism versus Arminianism. I certainly grew up doing that, but I don't hear a lot of Episcopalians fretting about these two thinkers. But I do hope you enjoyed sort of meeting them very, very briefly. And we may choose to talk about them or not. It's sort of up to you. But let me do what I always do and ask if there was anything in the readings or the video that got you thinking, or that you maybe wanted a little more perspective on from the group.
I don't really know what Arminianism is.
Yeah, so the book introduces you to this readings book. It introduces you to a couple of so Arminianism, right? Like anytime you put ism, you've institutionalized something that the original author maybe didn't intend to institutionalize. I mean, he's a thinker. Arminius was his name. And he kind of shows up in this book and in a lot of like Christian conversations. I'd tell you, particularly if you're Presbyterian, you're going to be very, very concerned with the Arminian Calvin tension, right? So Arminius basically says, I'm oversimplifying, but humans have free will. And Calvin says, not exactly. Everything's preordained, elected. You could think fatalistic. That might be a caricature, but John Calvin really has this sense of God's control is not arbitrary. It's maintained at all times. So that means what you think you're doing is firmly in God's control. Arminius says what you think you're doing. And God's control abides with your decision. In some ways has to submit to it, but God has chosen that, so God's still in control because God brokers that choice. Does that maybe make a little more sense?
Yeah.
That's a thumbnail sketch, right? And if you know anything about Calvin, there's like, he didn't write 5 points of Calvinism, but this got adopted afterward, right? 5 points of Calvinism. Usually you use the acronym TULIP. The T is for total depravity of human beings, like there's nothing good in us. I don't think it's biblical, but this has held a big sway over a lot of hymns that show up less in our hymnal, but yeah.
Well, my question is, with regard to what she was saying about that, was I favor the Arminian theology here, but the first thing that she explained was how God is in control of everything. He already has it all planned out and looking to, et cetera. God is watching that. Well, where's our free will in that?
Yeah, right. So there's tension between the two views. I mean, I would tell you, John Calvin does not think that we're complete puppets on strings or automatons, but he drifts more that way, right? So you're thinking about a spectrum, and like everything's fixed is over here and nothing's fixed is over here, and Calvin is more to this side and Arminius is more to this side. Neither one of them is completely extreme, neither one of them. And so there is tension. It's sort of like, well, and if you ask Calvin, this is this like thing I remember from my Presbyterian days. Well, look, if you don't have a choice about whether you're going to respond favorably to God, if you have no choice, then how can God punish you for that? Who are you to question God? That's the reply. Well, I must not be elect because the question is really important to me.
Yes, me too.
And if I were elect, maybe I wouldn't be so concerned. But so again, I think it's very easy to caricature somebody as complex as Calvin. I just want to complete the caricature, but then remind you not to limit him to the TULIP acronym. Okay, so total depravity, unconditional election. Once you are saved, you're always saved. So you can't lose it. Limited atonement. Not everybody is. Number 6 is an affix. Number 7 goes to heaven. I is irresistible grace. You may not even want to be elect. You have no choice. It's irresistible. When God chooses you, you are chosen. When God does not choose you, nothing you can do, you are not chosen. And then P is a real enigma. And this is how you know this is a caricature. P stands for perseverance of the saints. Now, you don't have to persevere if you're elect. It's irresistible. But this is how you hear the tension in Calvin himself. And many of you have heard of the Protestant work ethic. It's simply Protestants eat better, Catholics sleep better. I don't know if you know this. That's a 500-year-old idiom. And it came particularly from Geneva, because what Calvin said is, if you're elect, you'll be more productive. Well, shoot, I don't know if I'm elect, but maybe if I was more productive, I would be. You see how this goes? So this really did create, again, this thing called Protestant work ethic, which sort of says, like, we prove God's election with our perseverance. We don't earn it, we prove it. So if you're kind of sitting around not being productive, you're not elect. That's resulted actually in what I would call one of the roots of American workaholism, is the Protestant work ethic.
Well, now, isn't it? I thought that through your work, you recognize that you are elect,
Yeah, if you prosper in it and you work really, really hard all the time.
and then you recognize you are one of the elected people.
It's a little bit of prosperity gospelish, actually. Like, other people recognize your election because you're so productive and you work so hard. How, I mean, again, like, this is where there's no simple fix to this. How do you recognize your election when you have nothing to do with it?
Yes, but there are ways that you can. Go ahead.
But if everything, if everything has everything is a cause and effect relationship, then isn't, other than maybe atoms or something, isn't everything predetermined by what comes before it?
I mean, I didn't know that. I mean, that's actually a Tolstoy argument, if you've read War and Peace. Do you know about this? Tolstoy's thinking was free will is actually an illusion. Like, it's helpful for us to think about, but truly, you predetermine what you're going to do based on your past experiences.
Right.
So you think you're going to make a choice at the salad bar today, like, I'm really going to go bold and pick those craisins. But the only reason you did that is because you were predisposed to make that choice based on your parenting decisions and the way you grew up and what your appetite was when you whipped in. So that whole thing that I chose the craisins, you chose nothing.
Right.
That was predetermined by your personality. That's a nuanced version of Calvinism. And let's be honest, if you've had children, boy, you pretty much knew what they were going to do, right? Like, I picked red, of course you did, right? Yeah, there was no real choice, right? I gave you this choice, but we both knew what you were picking before I gave you the choice. So there is some element of resonance with it. What's hard for many of us is when you take something that, like, has resonance and then you codify it and say that's the rule. And I would tell you, you say that on both pieces, whether you're a Calvinist or you're an Arminian, like, the extremes are really, really hard, right? Because they cut off a lot of nuancing and possibility. Now, I have to tell you too, I'm not very sympathetic with John Calvin's position at all. In fact, I would disagree with every single letter of Tulip, every single one, except for irresistible grace. I agree with that, just not the way Calvin said it. It's coming to you whether you want it or not. Who's it coming to? everybody. So I can do I if I get rid of L. Does that make sense?
Is that where universal salvation comes in, or what is that phrase?
Yeah, so you kind of have to put through, there's a lot of like models that don't necessarily mix well, but have some overlap. So you can talk about universalism, and that's really the opposite of exclusivism. So exclusivism says, if you don't know the name of Jesus by name, you're going to hell when you die. Done. Inclusivism says, well, you can know Jesus without knowing his name. Like if, and forgive me, I don't want to sound stereotypical, but if you're an Aborigine in Australia, nobody told you, so you don't know, but you can have a relationship with God because God's everywhere, so God will cut you in. Universalism says, doesn't even matter what you do, God's got you. You can fight against it, and that won't make God mad. God will choose to catch you anyway. So those are like three discrete kind of positions that really have more to do with evangelism, but I do think turn into providence, right? So we have to think like, what does providence look like? Is it about getting as many as can? Is it about getting like to heaven as quickly as possible? Is it about redeeming everything no matter how long it takes?
But I have a hard problem understanding providence. Because if I'm here and in the house beside me is a person from India that believes in Hinduism, and we both have a heart attack, and I call 911 and his phone doesn't work, is that providence?
I think it depends on, this is the lovely thing, right? I mean, it really depends on what camp of thought you find yourself in. It could be the fact that you're asking that question, Tim, shows doubt. So you're probably going to help. Thanks for playing with me on that, but I'm being really serious, actually. And if you've grown up, like, I don't even care if you grew up in a Presbyterian Church of America, the PCA, that's really the harder lined sort of tulipian perspective. That could be a response you get. So you've got doubts about God's goodness, it's because you're not elect, right? You don't trust, so that's clear, you're not gonna make it. Like, that is a way of thinking.
Right.
Another way of thinking is, well, look, I mean, and she talked about this too, like, well, what do we do about cancer? Like, what's God's providence of cancer? Well, I mean, some people view that like God gives you the illness because of some reason. Tim, you're too prideful. I'll give you some gallbladder cancer. That'll really straighten you out. Or, geez, Tim, like, I saw you buy that extra donut instead of sharing that money with children in Africa. I'm going to give you cancer because that'll teach somebody to give their donut money, right? Like you've got these scenarios, and I know they sound silly, and probably most people would not agree with the statements I've made exactly, but they do sure hold the underpinning if you push them.
Yeah, that's true.
And so then, like, so again, like, what do you do with cancer? Well, if you say God created everything, then God made it. God did make it.
But is it good?
Well, this is a great question, isn't it? And I think you've got lots of perspectives on this. So one way people handle this goodness question is they say, well, everything was good, but then we messed it up. So once upon a time, there was no cancer. Eve ate that apple, and then cancer just appeared. That's what happens with disobedience, punishment. That's one response. Another response is, I hate to say this, but the cancer is actually really good at what it does. It grows really fast. I don't actually know anything that grows faster than cancer. It's not good for the host, ultimately, but it's good at what it does. So how do we hold on to cancer is good at what it does and human life is precious? and God made both things. I'm actually more interested in that than the other thing, even though it's hard.
I have a question. Um, My mother had cancer when she was much younger and I was much younger. But she survived and it was serious cancer. They brought her to MD Anderson and said, this is very serious and you will not live. She did. She lived to be 95 or something. And how does that happen? And how do you explain that? What was it? What was different about her?
This is where I think one of the things that's interesting, talking about time, I have a heart, and I'm going to tell you, I shared this with somebody at the table because we talked about this. I'm extremely wary of people who right now know that they're doing God's providential deeds. Like right now, God wants me to do this. That sends off alarms in my head. In my life, I look back and I say, oh, I think maybe God was in there somewhere. I'm much better able to see. And providence, I don't think means God causes events to happen, but like there's a ghost in the machine lubricating things through, I don't know, hey, Mike, do the right thing this time, please. Enough of that. And I look back and, hey, maybe you can call it coincidence. And I love that phrase we read a couple weeks back. Coincidence is God's way of getting our attention. Sometimes you look back and you say, there just has to be more than coincidence to that. Like, I guess that was providence after all. But in the moment, I don't ever know how you know this is it.
I think that we as human beings look for reasons behind the things that hurt us or that trouble us, or we look for meaning in tragedy. And that's how we cope with our grief.
Yeah.
Some of us. Just a kind of a short personal experience of that. My son, when he was 20, was killed in a horrendous, they're all horrendous, but a wreck outside of Albuquerque, New Mexico. I can't believe that God killed my son. I mean, if I think God ordained that, that is the God who killed my son. And I can't recover my faith from that. So I have to, in my thinking, have to believe that that was just life. There were things that led up to that, things in his past that led him to be in that place at that time. Yes, there was a continuation of cause and effect there, but I don't see God causing my son to die. However, out of that, my experiencing the grief of losing my son has come some amazing opportunities for me to help others. Up to that point, I had never, ever worked with anyone who had lost a child. That was, I worked with a lot of different people, but that particular situation had never entered into my work situation. Within 6 months after Jamie's death, I got a call from an EAP from Dow Chemical. And she said, Darlene, I have a client I need to refer you. This is a woman whose son was killed in a horrible car accident, and she's having trouble recovering. I was not recovered. I was still in the throes of tremendous grief at that time. Tremendous. And I remember standing at my desk, and saying, I can't accept this referral. I can't do this. And I was crying. I know she needs me, but I have nothing to give. And she said, Darlene, I know you can do it. This woman needs you. I eventually came around after a lot of tears and prayers, and I did work with her. And working with her was healing for us both. we healed together in that time. That's not the miracle. To me, the miracle is that I continued to get referrals from people who didn't know what I'd gone through, but women, men, families who had lost children. They just began to pour in to my practice. And I think back, what are you doing? You know, and so in my thinking there, to make sense of all of this, I was willing to attribute that to God. So where do I put that in my faith briefcase? You know, how do I fit that in? So, but that's my thinking too, that part of it was I needed, whether it was coincidence or God, I needed to see some kind of reason, some kind of sanity in Jamie's death. And so I was very human in that I created a reason for Jamie's death, and that helped me cope with Jamie's. I think that makes me Armenian. However, there's a part of me that thinks, did God send those people to me? Why all of a sudden?
But God can refer people to you without it being written in stone. I mean, that, the Armenian thing, God is always active in our lives. And you know, Jesus taught, because Jesus came, we are to live as resurrection people, you know, which is a sign of being the elect. I don't mean it should go to our heads or anything of that sort, but the thing is this. There's that living relationship, and so God probably, in my estimation, God probably did send those people. But whether I don't know anything about what started it all, but the thing is this, God is not static or stoic or whatever. It's just that there is movement. We're in a partnership with God. We work with God. So, you know, I go with this Armenian thing, and things will happen that you can't explain, even if you are not deeply spiritual. I mean, so, because otherwise, you know, do we really have a choice?
When I study the Bible, I don't have to pick a side myself. Both can be true. And I don't have the information to know which one and or how could they both be true. Because if you say we have enough knowledge to pick, maybe we don't understand all the mechanisms that and the power of God who can make them both be true. So sometimes I just have to say, well, I don't know.
How about
There's
a
two different-
little of each?
Yeah, exactly. And that's what the book says. Well, they talk about here. Some probably each needs the influence of the other, and certainly no one can be fair to the several themes of the scripture without appreciating both positions. So you know, I think it's good to know both positions, but I don't know that I have enough information to pick. But maybe they both are there. You know.
Yeah, and I do think it depends on, like, to me, the critical component, and there's tension in the Bible with this too, right? Is like the whole idea of limited atonement. So, like, I had a professor, again, I mentioned him before, who was really good, that said, hey, there's this coin, and we don't always realize there's two sides to the coin. On one side says, come unto me, all ye who are heavy burdened, and I will give you rest.
Right.
And on the other side says, you didn't pick me, I picked you. And that tension seems right. And in my head, well, then who did you not pick? That's, I think, the complicator. So as long as God picks everybody, I feel real good with that one. Right? I picked everybody, so come on. Since I've already picked you, come on. Now, this gets a little grubby, and we read this passage about predestination. And I want to make sure you get to see that Karl Barth arguably the most influential Protestant theologian of the 20th century, came up with this. It's not a sleight of hand, it's really just a clever read of Romans. You read in, no, not Romans, in Ephesians. And we read, it's in Ephesians. We read the beginning of Ephesians, right? And it says, those who God foreknew, God predestined for salvation in Christ. So Calvin read that phrase and said, aha, look, God's love is so precious and so valuable that people could not turn it down. That would be insulting. So instead of the possibility somebody turns it down, there's just limited time. But Karl Barth read that and said, hey, instead of some people are predestined and some others aren't, read the whole phrase. The ones who God foreknew, God predestined for salvation in Christ. Barth says predestination is not about us. Predestination is about Jesus being the mechanism to return home. Who did God foreknew? Well, everybody. And it wasn't that God predestined Darlene for one place and Ellen for the bad place. It's that God predestined Jesus, the incarnation, to be the mechanism of salvation. Does that make sense? If you read the whole sentence, what Barth says is the predestination is not about persons, it's about Jesus.
I guess my problem is I tend to be more of the universalist, and I'm thinking, well, okay, I'm a Hindu in India. I've heard of Christ, but I'm still a Hindu. Do I believe in Providence? I guess.
Does it really matter if you believe in Providence? If it exists, do you need to buy into it?
Well, no, I guess I don't have to buy into it. I'm just trying to understand it, how it applies. I mean, it can't be just for us. It has to be if God made everyone and everyone is good, then everyone is part of that. I think.
Yeah, and
Is
that presumes there's just one revelation, that God just revealed himself once to a set of people.
See,
How do I know he didn't reveal himself to people in different ways?
I think he did. I think he revealed himself with Buddha. I think he revealed himself with other people too. I think he has been revealing himself all along since man first came on the face of the earth.
You know, I feel very strongly what you just said, and this sentence stood out to me because I struggled with this whole thing. But this Israel was chosen not so much to be blessed as to be a blessing. And to me, it made me personally think that this Arminian and Calvinist views, this is two human men's personal interpretation of the Bible. And what this sentence says to me is, we're all chosen by God to be a blessing to others. So it's not so much the how or the why to me, it's that your reason for being here is to be a blessing to others, such as your story. It was beautiful how you turned that into, you're now a blessing to people. And that's what, he didn't choose you to be blessed, he chose you to be a blessing. And he chooses all of us to be a blessing. And we talk about these two interpretations, but to me, these were men who just came up with these theories. And I have my theory, which is, we're not chosen, we're all blessed and said, go out and do good and help others. And to me, that's what's important.
And I actually, what's interesting is, I don't know that Calvin would exactly disagree with what you said,
Yeah.
even though he'd want to put it in his own words, right? And that's the interesting thing. It's not an either or. There's gradients here, right? And that comes back to a little bit you know, does God cause car crashes? Let's take it something easier. Does God make hurricanes? Well, the answer has to be God made weather systems that allow hurricanes to form. So did God make that specific one? Well, I don't know, but God made weather systems where they happen.
And when they happen, look at the response. Look at the response of people when those things happen, which I think is all part of it. And it's made it. So what can we do with it?
Yeah, and I think that's what Tillich said in our readings that you also get in Romans that we often sometimes forget. So sometimes like the memory verse I got in Sunday school was God works all things to the good of those who love God and are called according to God's purpose. But Tillich reminds us that God is able to work all things to the good of those who love God. That's really different. Does, can.
Well, you know, with regard to this providence thing, and along with this land, when accidents, I don't think God caused your accident, but maybe it's your son's accident. But because you have that experience, then God knew God would send you people to help. You see, in other words, is it that when things happen that are not good for us, and our life changes because we change and God helps us change and so forth. But the thing is this, God just says, okay, they've got that experience, so I know some people I can send over there and I'll do it. And that's what happens. Because, you know, this being locked in stone is probably true, but on the other hand, you know, a relationship with God is a work in progress. It's a development, it's a growing, it's getting to know God at deeper and deeper dimensions. And so I don't know about all this, but the thing is this, what I do know and have experienced that God works with us. God works with me. You know, I hear God in ways I never heard God before because I sit down and God told me for more than a year, sit down, be quiet and listen. And finally the pandemic helped me do that. And so I have a deeper awareness and understanding of God. And, you know, the only thing I question God about is if you're in control of everything, what about that mess in Ukraine? You know, I mean, what are you going to do about food? Things that sort. But I think that we really need, that I found that what I need to really focus on is, okay, what is this living relationship that I have with God? I know God loves me, and it took me a long time to realize that. And so things in my life have changed, my perspectives have changed and so forth. So, you know, you can argue this doctrine all you want, but the thing is, what is our reality? What is, how do we relate with God? What is God to us? You know, what do we need to help us? And the thing is this here, that God calls us to a new way life, and this Jesus that he sent, who is what you referred to earlier in that scripture quote, for us to live as resurrection people, meaning that we have a freedom in God that people who don't seek God don't have usually. And the turning point in all of this is Christ. It's Jesus himself. In other words, you can question all this, but the thing is this, if Jesus is the pivot point, then we need to think about that. I lost my thoughts. So.
Yeah. You know, and you asked the question, well, God, what are you doing about Ukraine or whatever else? And I happen to think he's sitting up there and going, well, what are you going to do? You know,
Yeah.
what is your responsibility? And are you guys still having wars and things like that? I thought, you know, by now you would have grown out of that. you
Oh,
know?
yeah,
And
I
I think
have.
there was a point in there that he said that he made the Jew or Israelites the chosen people. But then I'm maybe badly wording it, goes, but the suggestion was, well, what a burden that was on them, because now they had to
Uh-huh.
act as people of God, you know, people of God.
And they flunked.
And yes, much higher expectations. He didn't put that on the Hittites and the Canaanites, and he put it on the Israelites. And so, yeah, maybe he has higher expectations for us.
But I want to put in here too, I think it's really important for me to put like a public service announcement here. And this is just my own thinking, right? So don't think God says time for a car crash so that you can help somebody deal with your feelings, right? And I think sometimes we say, yes, and that was so helpful because I chose to persevere and make my way through it. So now I've got this way of ministry, like I can help other people. And for me, it's really important to say like, and if you can't, if it crushes you for the rest of your life, God's love for you is not diminished at all, nor is your dignity as a human being. Oh, well, you just need to get over having your son die. You've grieved long enough. That's not okay. I just want to be really clear. That does not make you an unfaithful Christian. It doesn't make you an unfaithful person. And this is where I think, when I think of that providence and what control looks like, God controls the final destination of everything. And that seems to be about it. How long it takes us to get there, I think God's let that go. In the end, this is me now. I think God's control is everybody's going to get there together. Now, in the meantime, I sure hope you'll live into that future now. But if you can, I get it. I mean, that's about the best I can do with God's control, right? And, you know, like when people say like, oh, God told me to read this phrase in your book, that's cool. I mean, I don't know why I don't have those experiences myself, but that's cool, you know, or, hey, like I just really have this urge, and it must have been from God to attend, you know, St. Thomas. And I'm going to say maybe. That's not my experience. So maybe. And for me, it could be, I mean, again, you can always do this. Well, Mike, as if you believed more, you would have that experience. If your faith was stronger, right? That's called blaming the victim. And so it's really important we not to blame the victim. The truth is we're all wired differently. And sometimes we say so-and-so is such a spiritual person. And nobody is more spiritual than anybody else. I just want to be really, really clear. For me, that's really important because we don't live in a hierarchy. I used to teach at a fundamentalist school, and there was this conviction. Maybe this doesn't matter for you, but just tell you where I'm from. We had to read this book as teachers, and the book sort of argued that Christian people, because they know real revelation true and they have this relationship with God, are inherently better at doing anything than somebody who isn't Christian, which is a little bit bizarre to really think about, right? Because Albert Einstein was Jewish. So if he converted, would he have had a better theory of relativity? Would that have influenced his brain? Or like Usain Bolt, if he had a better denomination, would he be faster? My colleagues at the table said yes. But that's ludicrous. I mean, that's ludicrous. Is that not crazy? As if, and this is a way we understand like what elections like, God will pour out blessings and favor on you because you're elect. I mean, you look at the people in the Bible who are elect, they suffer the most. I mean, Mother Teresa internalized that. She wanted people to suffer because she thought it was cathartic. They were suffering with the Lord, even while she worked to be present with them in suffering. It was this like weird paradox of Mother Teresa's theology. I don't know if you know much about the lady.
Especially since she did not have a feeling sense of God.
Most of her life. Yeah. So I'm not saying that as a conclusion. I'm saying I'm trying to work out this stuff too, right? So cancer, not good. God made cancer. God says cancer's good. God does not delight in like my pain and my suffering. And yet God created a world where cancer develops. So what do we do with that?
We focus on the fact that God loves us and we work and we respond to God to deepen our relationship with God.
I think I could do that if I had the cancer. If my daughter had the cancer, hell no. I'm just gonna be really clear.
Yeah, of course, right, that's normal, yeah.
And I would get that God didn't give my daughter cancer, but I'd be pretty sour about it. I just, who wouldn't be sour about that?
This reading, William Temple, I don't know who that is, but I need to look him up. But he put the course of nature is not devised for man's convenience.
Ma'am, would you speak up a little
That-
louder?
I was saying in this, we were talking about hurricanes, et cetera, and Ukraine. William Temple in our reading 69, one of the things I underlined was the course of nature is not devised for man's convenience, but for his benefit. So that was an interesting comment to me, helped me understand some things personally.
That's very fine, isn't it? The difference between convenience
Yeah,
and benefit.
and benefits.
When I read, and we read a couple of scriptures, like we read Joseph's account to his brothers, right? And he said something to a phrase like, I was tested. And I did grow up hearing like, aha, God tests you. And it does make me wonder, is it that God tests us or is it just life that tests us? I mean, did God put the idea in Joseph's brother's mind, sell him into slavery? I would have a really hard time thinking that was God's idea. Have a really hard time. I understand, because I have a brother, why I would think that was a good idea. I still have times when I am find that a very, very lovely idea. Selling my brother into slavery. So like these ideas happen, and then what we do with them. I recently read a Jewish theologian who was referring to Viktor Frankl, and this is really interesting because Viktor Frankl essentially says something like, if you've read Man's Search for Meaning, the only thing you have control over is how you process events internally. That's it. So nobody can take away your processing, even though they can take away your food and they can take away your clothes. They can't take away your dignity because that resides in your own internal processing. So what Viktor Frankl says is there's two kind of things. There's victimization, where bad things happen to you. You've been victimized. Everybody in the room's been victimized by somebody at some point. And that's really different from being a victim. So people who came out of the Holocaust were absolutely victimized, but Frankl said if they were victims, they died. When they defined themselves as a victim and life's not fair and why is it me, and their whole fundamental orientation was, I'm a victim, then they lost their ability to persevere and find good in the world. Like, yes, evil things have happened to me, and I'm going to go forward. And that's a little bit of Protestant work ethic, Jewish style, actually, right? Like, I'm going to resist being a victim, though I've been victimized. It's sort of an interesting way how that goes together. And I say that as if one's better than the other, but to me, it's really important. Look, if I saw my wife and daughter burned up in an oven at Auschwitz and I couldn't ever get over it, well, that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
That I'm not a lesser person because I couldn't go forward from that.
I don't see how a child can be.
How a child can be a victim
Yeah.
instead of being victimized.
Yeah, a child going into the death camp. I don't. Yes, I have a problem with that.
Yeah, well, we all got problems with death camps, right? Like I hope that's trouble for all of us.
Yeah.
And anybody who is submitted to that is being victimized, right? And again, there comes a point when you're victimized, are you defined by your victimization, or do you say this happened and I'm going forward? Now, I can encourage people go forward, but a lot of empathy and compassion needs to exist for people who can't go forward. And of course, we always say, well, if it were me, I would figure out how to go forward, which is real convenient because it wasn't you.
That's
Right. You haven't walked in their shoes.
Thanks be to God, it wasn't us, right?
I used to
But-
read that
but
once
it-
a year. I don't know why, but I felt like it's an important book.
Man's Search for Meaning.
Mhm.
Yeah, I would like to read the sequel, Women's,
Mm.
How Women Have Found Meaning. That would be a nice sequel, but that doesn't exist. It's just about how men do it.
I think that the whole thing about how I feel, whether I've been victimized or I am a victim, is sort of at the center of a lot of our life. There are a lot of things that
Yes.
happen in our life. We can go through phases where how you feel about that helps you decide how you're gonna survive at the end of it, whatever it is that you're suffering.
Yeah, you have
That's
to,
critical.
if you're gonna survive, you've got to address it and confront it and work it to heal. You know, because if you don't, then yeah, you will die. In other words, a lot of people, there are people who, they make up their mind that they're going to die. In other words, they're tired of this life or things of that sort. And they're elderly and who's going to take care of all this other stuff, and some younger people. And believe me, if you make that decision that you're ready to die, and it really is, you will find yourself going weakening. And it will, and then eventually it comes about.
And that's okay.
And it's okay.
That's okay. That's our right. That's who we are. We make those decisions. That's okay.
Yeah.
Death is not, I'm hoping that death is not the end or the worst thing that can happen to us. But there are a lot of people that living is much worse than dying.
Well, and so that's an interesting thing, just a quick sidebar before we get to Susan, right? Sometimes we've decided that the chief of all virtues is survival.
The chief, say that again.
The chief of all virtues is
chief.
survival.
The chief, okay, the chief.
You say, well, I don't think that, but I don't know if you've ever been to a hospital. We treat people to extend their life for what reason? Well, because it's good that they live longer.
But
I mean,
we treat them because we can't accept that it's time for them to go. Yeah.
Or their family.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or the family, yes,
and
yes.
so like, I think we have to ask ourselves, and it's one of these like Providence questions, right? I don't want to frame it the wrong way. Is life inherently good? If we stay too long on that, then death is inherently bad. And I think that takes us to a real tricky spot here, right? Where like, oh, you know, I've got to, I mean, I can tell you, I was a chaplain in a heart hospital, and doctors, they like to do medical interventions that will prolong life. And we had to say, like, there's a DNR, stop what you're doing. Like, the patient doesn't want it. And the doctor did not want to stop because their obsession was do everything to prolong life as defined by heart rate and brain function, not by quality at all. Because who can really define what the quality of your life is?
Well, and that,
You can, the person. If
That-
they're able to.
Maybe. There's moments of my life where I thought there was no quality, and then 10 minutes later, it's like, oh, that was really rich.
Oh, I'm talking about when you're in the bed dying.
Susan, sorry, I waited a long time.
no,
Very
that's
personal
okay.
thing.
I just think of the times that I have heard on the news, you know, that a spouse passes away, and within a very short time, the other spouse does too. And it isn't that they're not saying life is worthwhile, but my life is less without this person, and I'm ready to be with them. My life is such that I'm ready to be with God and them in heaven, you know. It happens.
And I don't
More
see
often
that
than
as
you
a
think.
tragedy. I see that as
Natural.
natural,
Mhm.
yes, human.
Death is transition.
They're calling that broken heart syndrome now, and the medical field is recognizing it. There is a heart thing that happens, right? I read about this after Gary died.
Our
And
feelings affect our body and our body stops.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's psychosomatic, yeah.
yeah, yeah. My neighbor was told by her doctor she had broken heart syndrome. And I was like, okay. I mean, I understand broken heart. When you lose your spouse of 57 years, like I did, but when she told me what it meant, and then I researched it, I was like, wow. And people do that. She didn't, but yeah, you're right. The body changes. Great.
So I want to introduce another thing that came from our readings about God hardening Pharaoh's heart and people being objects of mercy or objects of wrath. This language shows up in the Bible. I don't like it because that seems very Calvinist to me, right?
Mhm.
How can God make you to be an object of wrath and then be mad with what you did? It just makes no sense to me whatsoever. I would say, and I don't have a solution for this, but when I think about it, I guess no matter what comes to me, my question is, am I going to be a subject of wrath or will I be a subject of grace? Somebody was talking to me this week and they said, hurt people can't help but hurt other people. What they didn't mean people who have been hurt. They mean people who are right now living in pain. Pretty reasonable to expect that they're going to share that pain until they've come up with a way to stanch the wound. Does that make sense? I don't want to universalize it. I don't. But sometimes you've met folk who were just unpleasant to be around. And then you got to know a little bit of their circumstance. And boy, God, they were in pain. I mean, they were in real pain. And what was unpleasant was them doing really well that day, right? Given where they were. And I think a lot of times we have pain and we share it, right? Like I review this in my marriage and with my kids. Sometimes I'll say stuff that I deeply regret and I trace where it came from. It's because I was hurting, right? And I didn't have the wherewithal to like hold that back.
Yes, and with regard to God creating people who are lovable and God creating people who are angry. One of the things that I've learned here at St. Thomas and through these various courses is that there are times when we really have to question the writer. In other words, maybe the person who wrote that sentence, that was his frame. In other words, by the way that they were thinking in that time, he saw that, God was doing that. Like a while ago, I asked a question, and I don't agree with, about, God, Ukraine and all this other stuff. I know it's God's responsibility to do something about it. But the thing is this, it's just, that was, I think we have to take into consideration what was their thinking at that time, because that's contradictory.
It is. And I think it resonates with experience because I don't know if you ever heard somebody say a phrase like, were you just put on this earth to bother me?
I've heard that.
You're like an object of wrath in my life. So there's like some resonance with the phrase, like experientially, even if I wouldn't put a capital T truth claim out. When I look at the Pharaoh story, it's like, what a dummy. Like, really? It took you 10 times to figure it out and then you still didn't figure it out? Oh, that could be me. Not in that exact scenario. I'm not in that, but there's lots of things. I mean, why did it take me 40 years to figure out this very simple thing? I don't know. It must be because God hardened my heart. It must have been supernatural holding me back from my own learning the supernatural thing could have been my stubbornness or my being closed or frankly, self-righteousness. I know I'm right about this thing. Hell with the consequences. I know I'm right.
Yeah, that all this being so locked in stone, son. God created us because God loves us and wants us to love God and to be, and we are in relationship with God, and that, so, all this, I think what we might be a way to address these problems of doctrine and so forth is what is our experience of God? Does the God we experience today, that we are in loving relationships, where are we with that? Because we're not going to answer these other questions because they don't have answers. So our focus is, okay, where am I with God today and how am I growing in God's love? Because you learn after a while to be able to sense that God is with you in some form, so, but that comes after working to develop your relationship, to respond, to be conscious of God, to pray for others and things of that sort. I don't, so, okay, that's what those things are, but that's not where I am.
Well, I think what you're saying is a little bit part of the reading that we read in John, which says greater love has no one than this, that they lay down their life for their friends, right? See, like in the middle of all these existential questions, why is this happening? I'm in the middle of pain. Greater love has no one than this. Regardless of what the circumstances are, we're called this, and I do want to make sure we hear like that a little more roundly, right? Lay down your life for your friends. If we masculinize that, that's like a man dying to protect his wife and child from some threat. Like that's virtuous, except then there's nobody left to help take care of him. Women don't have the luxury of losing their life. They have to lay their life down by staying alive.
And we don't hesitate to send men to war.
Well, men don't hesitate to go to war. I know a lot of women that hesitate their men going to war, but they didn't feel like they had much say in the matter. My grandfather went to World War II without asking his wife or children. He just went. And what did she think about that? Well, I don't know. They're both dead, but I can't imagine she was like unequivocal hoorah because there were 8 children.
But today, the women, they're in the armed forces too. They can be
Yeah.
there now.
Yeah.
I don't get it, but they do.
Well, and this is where,
No.
like, I think this is really good reminder to think how culturally and how culturally combative it is that a woman would be a suicide bomber. And that's sort of when you know things are really desperate. Because who will care for the children? In most cultures, it's not men. We just have to be
That's right.
honest about that, right? And that's again why a man can lose his physical life, and that's a luxury. Because there will be somebody else to take care of the responsibility. I think we're coming around on that. And maybe this is concerning for you, or maybe it's not, but a number of the DOD's done a study that, and they've sort of interviewed folks like, hey, if Russia invaded the United States, how many of you would stand and fight, or how many of you would try to flee? And like 70 years ago, 90% of the population would have stood and fought. And I'm sort of cooking the numbers a little bit. Less than 50% would stand and fight today.
Yeah.
And my brother was very disparaging about this, but for me, it's like, I'd have to run a calculus because I got a wife and a kid. So if I stand and fight and I die, then what are they going to do? Whereas if I caravan with them, well, now there's 3 of us. Well, that's really shallow of you to not stand for your, but I mean, this is a cultural change. You can label whatever you want, but it's a real thing where people are starting to think, I don't know that I would immediately rush off because I've got folk at home.
That's the argument. Are you better off red or dead?
Yeah.
Well, you see that calculus being played out now. I mean, Ukraine can make a choice. So we'll save the country, we'll back off so that our country's not destroyed, but give them Donetsk or what this province or that, or they can fight. They've chosen. But the Russians, who said, well, we like to conscript you into the Russian army, they're fleeing to Finland and everywhere else. So, you know,
Yeah.
you see it playing out differently in both countries. So,
You know, the world is tired of war.
Oh, I don't think so.
I don't either. There's too much profit in it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
I wish they were.
Yeah, war is profit. I saw that a lot in Vietnam.
But where is it today?
Oh,
Look at it in Ukraine,
Listen, there are new.
the
there are new-
weapons,
yeah,
defense,
arms,
sure, defense.
And there are new ones that
Spears.
we're just learning about, you know, that
I
are
know,
so far
the
advanced.
technology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, these suicide drones. I've been hearing about on the news.
well, I can tell you in Vietnam, there were civilians over there that were selling insurance and bonds, and stocks, and everything else, making tons of money off the GIs. Yeah, it just made me sick.
So this is this real tough thing, right? Where you start to say, where's Providence and all of that?
Yes.
And really, I think the real phrase is, and make sure you hear this interrogative, why, which is not a question word, that's an accusation word. Why does God let this happen? And what Herb said is like another response is, well, why do you let this happen?
Yeah.
Which is interesting to think about.
That's what I want.
Well, if we had a choice, we could say, I want God in my life or I don't, and we'd probably say, I want you. And God's saying, okay, I'll determine how, but it would be too difficult for you to figure out. Just, you know, I think that's where we are, just exactly how he does that. We're not there yet to understand.
I think what God is trying to do, you know, whether it's us or it's Hindus or anybody else, is to build community.
Well, and I think, you know, there's an interesting add-on to that, you know, same rabbi who argued that joy has nothing to do with happiness. In fact, you can be in a state of joy in a moment of deep pain or suffering. His criterion for joy is that you're present.
Oh, yeah.
Like you're fully present in the experience, no matter how unpleasant it is. And the threshold for joy is just presence, which is an interesting thing because, you know, most psychology I've read says that we're only about 10% present. We're thinking about what we're going to do tomorrow. How do we get here? I can't believe that was done to me. Oh, this really hurts. How am I going to fix it? Instead of elbow. What are you saying? You know, like this is kind of what we do, or we try to get out from a condition instead of, and look, the rabbi is not suggesting that we do nothing about suffering or pain, but what he is suggesting is that we're so like emotionally intensive averse, positive or negative, that we will run away without even feeling it. If you've been around small kids, the worst thing in a kid's life is boredom. It's the worst thing they can ever have. I kind of look forward to being bored now. I think I turned like in my late 30s. So I was like, I'd like to be bored today. This is sort of interesting how that turns. And part of what's hard about boredom is you have to be present with there nothing to do that you're enjoying at the moment. But you just sort of say like, yeah, I don't want to do anything. It can be relatively joyful to embrace boredom if you don't try to run away from it or solve it, right? Sometimes having embraced it, then you can solve it.
That's true. That's very interesting. Listening to this, just because I have thought the last thing in the world is I don't like being bored. I need to, you know, go sit and play the piano. I go read. I
Yeah.
work on a puzzle. I was just to sit to be bored. But that's, I don't know. Maybe there's something wrong with me.
No, it's not about right and wrong. I just think it's this, again, this is this one rabbi's definition of joy. And I've said this from the pulpit before, when I was marathon training, I was like listening to music or listening to books because I didn't want to think about running. And my wife said, like, you're spending all this time doing this. Like, what a shame that you don't actually enjoy it for what it is.
Well,
Only my wife can say things to me like that. Harsh and cruel, and yet she's somewhat right. So I will tell you, when I walk the dog, I do listen to books, but I don't put headphones in when I run because I'm not trying to escape running. I'm actually just, I've made a decision to do it, and I want to be there for the decision. And we all do this and that at different times, but it's an interesting thing to think of. You heard me say Sunday, and with real authenticity, I don't enjoy running 5Ks. I think they're terrible. And people say, oh, that's 3 miles. That's a long time. No. Like, that's really not a long time. And it takes your body at least 12 minutes to find a second wind. Some people, it takes longer. And for me, it's the first 3 miles before I get into like, where I'm not thinking about how hard I'm breathing and how fast I'm supposed to breathe, or are my stride lengths too long, or am I too much on my heels or my toes? After a while, you just can't think of that stuff anymore because you get muscle fatigue, or your brain just doesn't like to hold that one problem all the time. So it sort of says, well, here's a problem. We paid attention to it. I don't know what to do with it. And then you find your breath, you know, and sometimes it's because I just didn't do it long enough. So I don't know, like when I think about God's control, what does God control? As I said, the future, but I think maybe what God controls is always being present, and God's able, because God's willing to be present, to find joy even when God's real disappointed. I don't know if that makes sense. If God's fully present, then God is fully joy, even when it hurts, under this rabbinic definition. That's a brain twister. I find it pretty hopeful, actually, though.
I was a long distance cyclist for miles, went across country, did all kinds of stuff. The best times in my life were being on my bike and just, and I think God was with me all the time. When I went cross country, I carried a host with me. So I always had a host for every Sunday, 8 Sundays I was going to be gone. And I never had a flat. It's way off, but God was there, and I think He's always there.
And I think that's it. I mean, again, I think that's the way I can figure out God's presence, is God enjoys being present, even when it hurts, because God's chosen to not be yesterday and tomorrow, but to be here now. And here with you, whether you're making progress or not. See, one more thing I internalize as a parent is I'm always supposed to produce something in my kids. So we play games so we can learn manners and we can learn strategy. It's really important that you learn stuff when we play games instead of, you don't gotta learn anything.
Just playing a game, just playing.
We do art stuff so you can learn fine motor skills and so you can learn color. I have to do this in my head. I just have to. And if I'm not going to, I have to say permission to do nothing, permission to waste time. Oh, Mike, you can never waste time. Don't tell me what I need to tell myself. I need to tell myself, this is a waste of my time, and I'm going to let it be. And then it won't be. I don't know if that makes sense. When I'm not fighting it anymore, then I'm in it. I don't know. That's, to me, like, I guess today, that's what I'm thinking about God's control.
Tim and I sit outside on the back porch, and we had picked a glass of wine, and we have this kitty cat that keeps twisting between our legs. I just love that. We just love sitting out there. Tim will say, if we're just inside doing stuff, he'll look at me and say, honey, let's go sit outside. Well, I wish that kind of thing for everybody. I think it's wonderful.
I think I told you before, my colleague says that's exactly the reason we sit in the same seat every week in church. Because one time something special happened in that seat, so we better put ourselves back in that seat so it can happen again. Really compassionate about understanding, I thought. Susan?
Well, I have a couple of adult coloring books.
Mhm.
And I
They're so
bought them.
small. They're so tiny.
And I thought to myself, oh, and I got, all these beautiful colors and all 9 yards. And then I started one and, oh, but I should be doing this.
Mhm.
Or I should be doing that. And so I kind of put it away. And now I know exactly where it is. And there are times that I'll get it out and maybe for 5 minutes, maybe for 2 hours. But my mind goes kind of blank and quiet. And it's relaxing because I'm not thinking about the next thing. I'm not thinking about what I should do, what I need to do. But just every so often, it just kind of brings me down and lets my mind kind of open up actually to God's presence. That the mind isn't going to this all the time.
Mm. So you've stopped shooting all over yourself.
Yes.
And that is interesting to think is our image that God follows us around saying you should do this, you should do that. This is should a word in God's vocabulary.
Shoulda, woulda, coulda.
I'm really grateful for your time on this. Next week, I won't be here at clergy conference. And so Herb Meyer has generously agreed to be our facilitator next week when we talk about covenants. And I know, Herb, you got pre-work for us, right?
Yes. And you'll be gone the week after?
I'll be gone the week after, and Darlene has agreed to host week number 8 for us. I'll be in Utah on vacation. I didn't want to miss 2 weeks in a row. I just didn't want to do that because it throws the rhythm off. So 1 would have been okay, but 2 wasn't going to be okay. And when I come back, let's also talk about if anybody wants to be a facilitator, even while I'm here, that would be lovely for me that we take turns to do this if you're interested. Nobody has to, but what Herb's got is some thoughts here to get us framed on some of the different covenants that that you're going to see, because we're going to read about covenants.
Yeah, and he used the right word. I'm not gonna teach next week. I am going to leave. And so I need your help.